really matters? That might be the most important question you can ask. So let's talk about it. Welcome to What Really Matters podcast, Everyday Spirituality with Karen Wyatt. Thanks for joining me. I'm glad you're here for another episode. Today I'm going to continue talking about shadow, which I introduced last week. If you hadn't listened to last week's episode, you might want to go back and take a listen to that before you hear this one, because today I'll be talking about how to recognize your own shadow. So I'll reiterate a little bit of what we covered last week. The shadow consists of the parts of yourself that you don't want to see or cannot see. Things that are hidden away from your view and your consciousness in your everyday life. So the shadow is kind of the dark part beneath your consciousness where frightening or unpleasant memories are kept. They're hidden away, and this includes grief or any painful or traumatic experience that you're not able to look at directly and accept and carry and live with in your everyday life. So the shadow is a part of all of us. It develops actually as a protective mechanism because sometimes we have experiences, especially when we're younger, that we simply cannot carry. The emotions involved in them are too big for our younger psyches to manage, and we would be shattered or broken if we had to carry every detail of those experiences and every iota of pain that they contain. And so the shadow is a safe place where those emotions and those memories can be tucked away for us. They're still there, they're still within us, but they're not part of our consciousness until something triggers a memory that can open the shadow and make them return to consciousness, to the surface. So the issue, and it's really interesting because right now I'm doing some writing on a grief journey that I took. So I'm reading a lot of books about grief, and Frances Weller, whose book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, that I'm revisiting, wrote that the shadow really contains a lot of our hidden grief that we either have not been able to process or have been unwilling to process. And maybe it's partly because our society doesn't value dealing with grief, so it's natural and normal these days to simply shove it aside. But he was emphasizing the fact that once we dive into the shadow, we're likely to find a lot of grief there that needs to be processed. I really liked this line he wrote: "Unexpressed sorrow blocks our access to the soul." And so this is exactly what I've been talking about for the last few weeks. We have to accept our mortality, look at death, deal with our grief if we want to grow spiritually. The only way we're able to grow in higher consciousness is if we open up the shadow, expose it to the light, and reintegrate those parts of ourselves that have been rejected and siloed away and hidden from us. So this is why it's so essential to do this shadow work if we truly do want to grow spiritually. And so I'm going to devote a few more episodes to this topic because it's probably one of the most important things we could be doing right now in order to help ourselves grow and transform and transcend the level that we're at right now spiritually. So the ultimate goal of working on our shadow and exploring the shadow is to bring what is hidden there to the light, so that it can heal and be reintegrated into the whole of our being. Until we reintegrate the parts of ourselves that have been separated off in the shadow, we aren't really whole or complete. And again, as Frances Weller said, we're blocked from the path that would help us continue to evolve and grow. And in an interview I did last year for End of Life University, Oceana Sawyer made the statement that the pain we don't transform, we will transmit. And that's one other important piece of information to have about the shadow. It contains our pain. And if we do not transform our pain, heal it, and reintegrate it into ourselves, we will transmit that pain to other people in the form of projection, where we will see other people as having all the negative characteristics that we don't want to look at within ourselves. We will blame other people for the pain that we feel. We will inflict that pain on other people so that we don't have to feel it ourselves, but we have an outlet for it by causing someone else to feel pain. So these are the negative consequences of ignoring the shadow and failing to transform the shadow. That's why it's so important for us to keep working on it. So today I want to talk a little bit about how to recognize your own shadow, because the fact is the shadow is hidden from us. And again, in the beginning, it's hidden for a reason. But many of us are not quite aware of what is in our shadow exactly. What is there? We don't exactly see it. We don't quite know what the character traits of ours are lurking there in the shadow. So we need some helpers, some ways of examining our shadow and discovering it and uncovering it. So I have a few suggestions here of things that you can try to help you recognize your own shadow and see it when shadow behaviors are showing up here and there in your day-to-day life. This is really essential awareness to have. It's so important to be able to recognize your shadow, because you can't begin to heal it if you can't see it and look at it for what it is. So let's talk about these 4 things that you can do to recognize and discover your own shadow. And the first that I recommend is to examine conflicts in your work or daily life. And I encourage you to keep a journal and write in a journal every day about some of these issues, but you may want to look back at who have you had a difficult encounter with over the last few weeks. Which people or what person do you tend to clash with? Who bothers you? Who do you just feel it deeply inside you don't like for some reason? You may not even know what the reason is, but you feel a dislike for someone. It might be that someone pushes your buttons. Every time you're with them, they say or do something that just sets you off inside, that creates this cascade of negative emotions inside of you. Who is that person in your life who has that effect on you? It might be someone that you work with, and therefore you're forced to be around them more often than you would like. It might be a family member that, once again, you need to be around for various reasons in your family. It could even be a friend that you don't see very often anymore because you choose to stay away from this person if there are negative interactions that keep happening. But I would suggest you start by make a list of any people that fit in this category, that bother you, that push your buttons, that you tend to feel bad inside when you're around them. Now, I know there's a lot of common advice going around right now that says if anyone makes you feel bad, get them out of your life. Stop seeing them. Do not have them in your life. I understand the rationale behind that, because who wants to feel bad all the time? And none of us needs to have someone around us who's going to cast a shadow upon us, who's going to make us feel bad. But don't forget that sometimes those people can help you learn valuable things about yourself. So you may be choosing to spend less time with those people, but it's still important to be able to look at your relationships with them and understand a little more deeply what the issues are that are coming up with you. So I would suggest that you make a list. They might be people you see all the time. They might be people you've stopped seeing, but make a list of who those people are and write a little bit about them. What are their major characteristics? Try to understand, what is it about them that pushes your buttons? What is it that they do or say? How do they behave? What is it that you struggle with whenever you're with them? And maybe you only have one person who has this effect on you. Maybe there are a dozen. I don't know, but it could be helpful to just write their names down, write something about each person, and begin to analyze how you feel when you interact with those people, and then their most common character traits. And I want you to look at the list of people and compare them to one another to discover, are there any patterns? Are there any character traits that they all have in common? Do they all have a certain brusqueness about them? Or are they all a little bit egocentric? Or are they all overly codependent and you can't tolerate that behavior either? Just begin to look, what are the commonalities between these people on your list, if there are any? The reason to look for that is that one thing we know about the shadow is that any of our own character traits that we have that we can't tolerate within ourselves, perhaps because we've been taught that this is a bad way to behave, or only bad people have this character trait, we may have repressed that trait within ourselves. And that situation is ripe for projection onto someone else. Whatever we're repressing about ourselves, we will be quick to notice in other people. So the things that we're the most critical of others for might be traits that we also carry, but that we're in denial about, that we are unable to look at or see within ourselves. So it's normal to be in denial. It's normal to not be able to see it. At this stage, I'm just suggesting you try to identify any traits your list of difficult people have in common, and hold open for yourself the possibility that you yourself might possess some of those traits as well. You don't need to push yourself to try to see that or accept that right now. It's fine if your mind initially says, no way, there's no way I would ever behave that way. That's fine. Just though, write this little list, notice the traits this person has, and sit with it for a while. And allow yourself to recognize, like, isn't that interesting? All of these people have this one thing in common. And you could ask yourself the question, do I have a tendency toward that character trait as well? For example, if it turns out that all of these people tend to brag about themselves and their accomplishments a little bit too much, to the point of making everyone around them feel uncomfortable. They talk about themselves and they praise themselves a little bit more than seems acceptable or normal. Say, I'm just throwing that out as an example. You might ask yourself, do I ever do that? And initially the response in your own mind might be, of course not. I hate that kind of behavior. I would never do that. But when you sit with it for a while, and possibly it will take weeks or months, you might one day recognize, oh my gosh, I was just bragging about myself, just like I hate when Mary does that. I just did that. It might help you begin to see within yourself behaviors that right now you're in denial about and you cannot recognize. So this is number one. Examine the conflicts with other people in your work or daily life. Figure out who those people are, what character traits do they have in common, and then just store that information. Keep it there in your journal for future reference. So the next place to look for your shadow, this is number 2, is to search out in your mind and write about situations when you tend to lose control, maybe over your temper or other emotions. And start to think about those situations. What are they? Is it when you're stuck in traffic, or when someone doesn't show up when they said they would, when you have a mechanical failure of some equipment you're trying to use, when you lose a game or some sort of competition that you're involved in with other people, when you have to wait for something longer than you expected to have to wait. Start to write down some of those circumstances, those that have happened in the very recent past that you can remember really well. When was it? What caused me to lose control over my temper or over my emotions in the past week? Begin to write down any of those situations that you can remember. And as time goes on, keep adding to that list. Keep writing about it if you see yourself losing control in other situations as well. And what we want to get to here by doing this exercise is to analyze the emotions that are occurring. First, look at the surface emotions. Oftentimes it's anger, but you might feel some sort of righteousness. You might feel blame toward another person. You might feel victimhood, as if you're being harmed and taken advantage of by the situation. Look at what's on the surface that you're feeling, and those emotions will all feel justified and be justified by the circumstance that you're in. So we're not trying to create a scenario where you judge yourself for having these emotions. Simply want to articulate what the emotions are that are on the surface. But the next step is to look a little bit deeper underneath those surface emotions to find what might be hidden behind them. Is anything else happening inside of you that's part of being triggered, but that isn't obvious to you? You have to look a little deeper, because sometimes what's really happening inside of you is a feeling of shame or humiliation, especially when someone else said they would show up and they don't show up. You might be feeling rejected. You might be feeling embarrassed. You might be feeling like you're not good enough. You might be feeling fearful, like something bad could happen to you if you fail and don't do well enough at this, whatever it is you're trying to do. You may have a lot of negative, painful emotions underneath your anger that are actually fueling the anger. So over time, you want to be able to identify those hidden emotions and get in touch with them, because they will lead you to whatever pain or trauma is hidden within. And these painful emotions are the doorway into deeper memories and deeper wounds within your consciousness that you're holding on to. So learn how to look beyond the surface. Yes, anger, and we're not saying you shouldn't be angry or don't have a right to your anger. Yes, but recognize that anger is oftentimes just the surface of a very deep iceberg, and that there's way more to the story than just anger. Anger is what is being displayed and what is being shown of your emotions, but there are other feelings behind anger. So in your journal, begin to write about that. What else was there? What was I feeling in my gut? What was causing me to feel really tense inside? What other painful feelings were present when I was getting angry about the situation that I was in. The more you practice doing it, the more easily you'll be able to get in touch with those deeper emotions and begin to write about them. And you will also begin to see a pattern, and you will begin to see which deeper emotions seem to be coming up for you very often. And you'll know that's a path that you can follow into your shadow. And in probably next week, I'll give you a specific practice you can use to explore those emotions. But for now, it's enough to just work on recognizing them and beginning to identify some of the hidden emotions that are present. So another step that you can take are to scrutinize any blow-ups that you have with other people, any out and out fights or times when you have a major meltdown and you might say something terrible to another person, and maybe you say awful things or slam the door or behave in a way that ultimately feels embarrassing to you, but that you cannot control in the moment. So anytime you have a blow up like this, it's very important that you journal about it once again and sit down to analyze it as soon as you possibly can. So first of all, just write down the details of what happened when you're able to. This event happened, the other person got upset, I got upset, they said this, I said this, then this happened, then this happened. Simply just write down the details and the facts of what happened. Be sure you list who was involved, the other person or people who were there, who were part of it, who contributed to it, what exactly was happening, where you were, and how you handled things. You want to be able to review these notes so that you can get insight into what triggered your negative response at that time. And once again, begin to look underneath the obvious for hidden emotions. Another thing that you can use this for is to look at this incident and what happened and trace back through your memory to try to find other times when something similar might have happened, perhaps with the same person, or perhaps it was just a similar situation with someone else when you felt the same way or behaved in the same way. And if you begin writing about these blow-ups when they happen now, you will have a record of them, which will help you go back in the future and look for patterns that are there. Once again, we're trying to get to the emotion that's hidden underneath. And so particularly these explosive incidents when we argue with another person are usually really rich with information. And so, but it's tender and it sometimes is very hard to look at. So as I was suggesting in the beginning, simply write down some of the details and some of the facts. You can leave out the emotion if you want to, and just write exactly what happened from your perspective, because you'll be able to use that in the future to review the situation, replay it in your mind, and perhaps begin to look more deeply at the emotions that were there. So be aware of any times when you have these major meltdowns or blow-ups that happen. They're embarrassing usually. Usually once it's over, we feel a little bad about ourselves, or sometimes we're in denial about that shame. So we make up stories about why it was the other person's fault and how they triggered something in us. They started it. It was their fault. We just did what came naturally to us and we're totally justified in how we behaved. That might be our response in the beginning when we first look at one of those situations. And that's fine too, because as we begin to look at the shadow, it's normal to have our defenses up, and it's normal to want to protect ourselves from too much scrutiny. And it's normal to have difficulty looking more deeply. But once again, when you record these details, they will be helpful to you later. If you can't look more deeply right now, later on, in time, as you do more and more shadow work, you may be able to. And so the story of one of these blow-ups might be exactly what you need down the road to dig more deeply and to get into the history behind the blow-up, the emotions underneath it all, and even a deeper story that's been hidden away of something that might have happened long, long ago, perhaps even something in childhood, perhaps something that happened when you were a toddler that you barely remember. So we're going to go deep here with the shadow, and it goes all the way back. We've been growing our shadow since we were first born, since we first came to consciousness ourselves, and so we've been putting things into our shadow all along. So this is a long process and ongoing work and a pretty deep excavation in the end. So any work you do right now to just record this information will definitely be helpful later on when you begin to look at it. So a fourth suggestion is to analyze your dreams. It's very interesting that sometimes shadow information begins to come to us, and especially once you start this work, once you just lift up the corner a little bit and peek in to the shadow and let a little bit of light in, your subconscious mind may be trying to show you things that you need to know and might be using your dreams as ways to get information across. So dreams can be really rich and in many ways are somewhat non-threatening as a way of looking for information. So I advise you, if you're able to keep a dream journal, which might just be a small notebook that you keep on your nightstand at the side of your bed, so that as soon as you wake up in the morning, you can write down any dreams that you can remember. It doesn't matter if the dream doesn't make sense and you have no idea what it's about or what it's referring to. Just jot it down, some notes about that dream or things, whatever it is you remember, whatever stands out in your mind. Sometimes dream analysis is better done in retrospect down the road anyway. And one dream might just be giving you a tiny piece of something, and you may receive more pieces in future dreams. And perhaps at a later date, all of them will come together and make some sort of sense. So it might be that you wake up with a huge insight and recognize what your dream was all about and what it was trying to tell you, but it might not be. So don't feel bad if your dream seems ridiculous and nonsensical. Just jot it down. Jot down what it was about. And again, this is all information that you can go through at a later time and reread and re-explore as you're looking for that shadow information. So for myself, I had a dream one time that a stranger was trying to get inside a house where I was staying. And this is kind of like your typical horror movie. Some stranger was trying to get in, and I was frantically locking all the doors and closing all the windows and the curtains to keep the stranger out, running around doing everything I could. So what I recognized in the morning when I woke up is that dream is telling me that there's something I'm trying to keep away from my consciousness. The stranger is a part of me in my shadow that I am afraid of looking at. And I'm afraid that whatever this is that I'm keeping hidden could hurt me somehow. So I'm trying to keep it out of my conscious awareness. So I'm locking all the doors and all the windows frantically. But what it also tells me is that this strange part of me, this part that I've hidden away, is trying to reach me, trying to get through to me, trying to get me to open the door, to let it in so that I can work with it and reintegrate it. So that dream tells me subconsciously, my mind is working on trying to bring up some things that I need to look at, but I'm still too afraid to let that happen. And it's okay. I don't need to change anything. Just having that awareness is very valuable to me because I recognize anything I can do that helps me feel more safe in my world, or more safe looking at my past or dealing with old pain and wounds, is going to help me open the door and let this, quote, stranger inside so that I can look at it and get to know it and get more familiar with it. So this is how I'm telling you that dreams are symbolic, they're metaphorical, they do not always make sense. But when you start to record them, first of all, you'll start remembering them better. As soon as you honor your dreams by writing them down and paying attention to them, your mind kind of wakes up and says, oh, let's remember these dreams then. So you'll have more memorable dreams. And when you wake up in the morning, you'll retain bits of them that you can write down. And once again, can be a really rich source of information. So I encourage you to keep that dream journal. So let's review those 4 things to help you begin to recognize your shadow. And again, this takes a lot of work. It's not simple. But once you start working on it, I guarantee you'll be learning and seeing things every day that will begin to come up for you. It starts happening for you fairly quickly as soon as you have the intention of wanting to go into your shadow and examining it. So, number 1, look at conflicts in your work or daily life, and particularly just people that you don't like, that make you feel uncomfortable, that you have like a lot of negative thoughts toward, or you get a knot in your stomach every time you're with them, and people that like trigger you somehow or push your buttons and you don't quite know why. But write their names down, examine their characteristics to try to see if there's any commonalities between those people. Secondly, examine situations where you tend to lose control of your temper. And this is not necessarily with another person, but just a situation that you're in where you feel really angry and pissed off, and you lose it somehow, and you want to take it out on someone else because you feel so upset inside. So just frustrating situations that you're in that you tend to react to in a big way, write about those and find any commonalities in those situations that you have, and then look for the surface emotions, look deeper for the hidden emotions. And number 3 is something similar to scrutinize any actual blow-ups or fights that you have with other people where you actually say angry words to one another and totally lose it with another person. Write those down in detail, record them, even though it may be painful to look at. Record what happened, what you were thinking and feeling, what you said. And even if you don't understand it and can't look more deeply, hold on to that for future reference. And the 4th is keep track of your dreams and begin to look to your dreams for little clues and pieces of evidence that start to tell you something about your shadow, about what's happening in your subconscious mind and what is trying to come to the surface in your subconscious. Last week, I made the point that in general, this is what I've found when people do this work. You really don't have to be afraid of what is stored in your shadow, even though most of us are somewhat afraid of having these emotions and memories come to the surface, that they've been stored in order to protect you. They will stay stored if you still need protection. So they won't, the reason they're coming to the surface and the reason that you're being pushed in this direction is because it's the right time now to look at some of this information that's been hidden away. So I encourage you to start doing this shadow work and start paying attention and looking for evidence of your own shadow and what might be hidden away there. So next week, I'll be back and we'll talk a little bit more about some practices that you can do for healing the shadow. So until then, remember that we're here for love. So face your fear, be ready for whatever happens next, and love each and every moment of your very precious life. Bye-bye.